My name is Emily, I'm 22 years old. You might wonder how a girl my age ended up living with her uncle and his wife, especially given what I'm about to tell you. Believe me, I didn't expect it either. Life seemed to pull me into a whirlwind of events that I couldn't predict. I study graphic design, and most of my life revolves around projects, freelancing, and late nights at the computer. But despite my busy life, everything changed when my mom got a job in Europe, and I needed a place to stay while finishing college. My refuge became the home of my Uncle Benjamin, who since childhood has been more to me than just a relative. Ben was my mother's older brother, and the person who was always there in difficult moments. He taught me how to ride a bike, fixed my toys, and told stories that I listened to with bated breath. His wife, Clara, was the complete opposite. Her restraint, almost icy calm, made me feel like an outsider. They lived in a beautiful house in a quiet town in Ohio, far from the city bustle I was used to. From the beginning, I tried to keep my distance, focusing on my studies and not intruding on their life. My room at the far end of the house became my sanctuary. But as time passed, I began to get used to this place, its measured rhythm, and the people who inhabited it. Ben was always friendly. His support helped me cope with my studies and doubts about my abilities. Clara remained distant, her presence more cold than hostile. Sometimes I felt that my very presence irritated her, but I tried not to pay attention to it. One day, when Clara was away, I noticed how easy it was to talk to Ben. We talked about trivial things, but in those conversations I felt a warmth I hadn't experienced in a long time. He supported me when my projects didn't work out, when I felt like my work had no meaning. His words were sincere, and his gaze was kind. I didn't know what exactly bothered me, but with each passing day, his presence became more than just comforting. One evening, after an especially tense day, I decided to go out to the terrace. Ben was there, engrossed in a book. His face seemed calm and his posture relaxed. I stopped for a moment, not knowing if I should disturb his solitude. "Can't sleep?" he asked, noticing me. I smiled weakly and sat down next to him. We talked about the weather, movies, work. But behind these conversations there was something more. I felt a tension between us that I couldn't explain. His gaze sometimes lingered on me longer than usual, and my thoughts raced, trying to understand what was happening. When I returned to my room, thoughts of that evening wouldn't leave me alone. My heart was beating faster than usual, and I couldn't understand why his words and gestures caused me such turmoil. It was a strange feeling, as if I were standing on the threshold of something that would change everything, but I didn't know if I should take a step forward. Several weeks passed since that evening on the terrace. I tried not to think about what was happening between Ben and me. Everything seemed as before. I was busy with my studies, completing orders, spending evenings at the computer. But every interaction with him made me feel something new, something I couldn't get rid of. Ben often came to my room to see how things were going. His friendliness always seemed natural, but now it caused me excitement. One Sunday, when Clara was away again for the whole day, we were left alone. I tried to spend this time working, but I still felt his presence nearby. Towards evening, he came into my room with a cup of tea. "You look tired," he said, setting the cup on the table. "You're not one of those who take breaks, are you?" I smiled, trying to hide my embarrassment. "Work won't do itself." He laughed, but there was a note of concern in his voice. "Emily, I know you're used to handling things on your own, but sometimes you need to relax a bit." His words touched me. They sounded as if he knew more about me than anyone else, and perhaps that was true. Later that evening, I went outside to get some fresh air. Ben was there again, sitting on the terrace and reading. When he saw me, he closed the book and smiled. "Join me," he offered, pointing to the chair next to him. I hesitated but sat down. We talked about movies, his work, life in this town. But even in these ordinary conversations, I felt tension. His gaze was too attentive, his words too personal. I caught myself thinking that I was waiting for his touch, even though I knew it was wrong. At some point, he lightly touched my hand to get my attention. It was a fleeting movement, but it took my breath away. I met his gaze and time seemed to stop. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Yes, I replied, but my voice sounded shaky. His eyes lingered on me a little longer than usual. I felt something inside me tearing apart. I didn't know how to deal with this. All I could do was stand up and leave before this feeling overwhelmed me completely. Later that night I couldn't sleep. His touch, his words, his gaze, everything filled my head. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but every time I closed my eyes I saw his face again. My heart was beating so hard that I could feel it in my throat. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. The next morning I avoided him. I felt ashamed of my thoughts, of what I allowed myself to feel. I tried to focus on my studies, but every time I heard his footsteps or voice, everything inside me burned. I knew this couldn't last long. What was happening between us was more than we could control. Everything changed one of those evenings that start unremarkably, but end up turning your whole life upside down. Clara had gone to visit her sister again, leaving Ben and me alone. The house was quiet, as if waiting for something to happen. I sat in my room trying to focus on a project, but my thoughts kept returning to Ben. I heard him walking around the house. His footsteps echoed down the hallway and then faded. I peeked out of my room to see where he was and noticed the light coming from the living room. There he sat, engrossed in a book, with a cup of coffee beside him. My feet carried me downstairs before I could think about why I was doing it. His gaze lifted as I approached, and a soft smile lit up his face. "Can't sleep?" he asked, putting the book aside. I shook my head. "Work isn't going well. Decided to take a break." "Have a seat," he offered, pointing to the spot next to him on the couch. I sat down, trying to keep my distance, but his closeness was still palpable, like a heat that couldn't be ignored. We started talking about something insignificant, the weather, movies, weekend plans, but there was something in the air that couldn't be ignored. This tension, which I had tried to deny for so long, was now tangible. At some point our conversation died down and we just sat in silence. His gaze rested on me and I felt my breathing slow down. His hand suddenly found itself on mine, a light, almost accidental touch that seemed both innocent and forbidden. My heart skipped a beat. "You look tense," he said softly. His voice was gentle, almost a whisper. "Just tired," I muttered, not daring to meet his gaze. But he didn't remove his hand. His touch was gentle, but it made everything inside me boil. I looked up and our eyes met. At that moment I realized that there were no more boundaries between us, even though we both tried to maintain them. I don't know who made the first move. Everything happened so quickly, as if something inside both of us broke. His lips touched mine, at first tentatively, as if he was afraid I would push him away. But I couldn't. My hands reached for his shoulders and his for my waist. It was so natural and yet so wrong that my head spun. His kisses became more confident, and I felt myself giving in to this forbidden desire. I knew we were crossing a line that would change everything forever, but at that moment it didn't matter. There was only him, his warmth, his breath, his hands holding me as if afraid to let go. First I licked the nuts, and then I moved my lips along the banana. I liked its color and smell, the perfect length and excellent shape. Our bodies began to move in unison, in rhythm with our breaths. I felt every inch of his body. The rhythm of his movements sent shivers of pleasure through me. We started scratching each other's skin. The movements became less romantic, more animalistic. We touched each other and enjoyed it. When he reached the climax of this endeavor, I knelt down to honor him as a man. At the most anticipated moment, I felt the full power with which his pride and potential could burst out. Later that night, I returned to my room but couldn't sleep. Memories of his touches, his lips, the way he looked at me wouldn't leave me alone. I knew this would change everything, and I knew there was no going back. The next day, everything seemed normal. The morning began with familiar sounds. The noise of water from the bathroom, the creaking of floorboards on the stairs, the quiet conversation between Ben and Clara in the kitchen. But everything inside me was different. My head was full of memories of the previous night, of how our lips met, how I felt the warmth of his hands. It seemed like the world around me had changed, but no one noticed. Clara left the house earlier than usual, citing some business in town. This left Ben and me alone. I tried to focus on my tasks, but every time I heard his footsteps or voice, my heart beat faster. At some point, I heard him come up the stairs and stop outside my door. He knocked and then entered, and I looked up. His face was serious but also gentle, as if he was struggling with the same feelings I was. "Emily," he began but fell silent, as if unable to find the words. He sat on the edge of the bed, looking at me. "We need to talk." I put my laptop aside, feeling my heart tighten. "I know," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "What happened yesterday? It was wrong. We both know that." I looked away, feeling a heaviness rise in my chest. His words were expected, but no less painful. I wanted to say something to explain, to justify myself, but all my thoughts were jumbled. "I don't know what that was, but I can't just forget it," I said, finally gathering the courage to look him in the eyes. "I can't pretend nothing happened." His face softened, and I saw the same pain in his eyes that I felt. "Emily, this isn't just about us. It affects not only you and me. There's Clara. There's family. We can't continue this." His words hit me harder than I expected. I nodded, feeling tears well up in my eyes. "You think I don't understand? I know it's wrong. But what am I supposed to do with what I feel?" Ben didn't answer right away. He looked at me as if trying to figure out what to do. His silence said more than words. His gaze was full of guilt, confusion, and something else, something I couldn't decipher. He reached out and gently took my hands. "Emily, I need to think. I need to figure out how to live with this. But I want you to know that I never wanted to hurt you." His touch was warm, but it also burned. I squeezed his hands in response but said nothing. All I could do was sit in silence, feeling the threat of something inevitable stretching between us. Later, when Clara returned, the atmosphere in the house became even more tense. I tried to avoid them both, staying in my room and pretending to be busy. But every time I heard their voices, everything inside me churned. At some point, Clara knocked on my door, and I barely kept myself from panicking. "Emily, you look a bit tired," she said, peeking into the room. Her gaze was piercing, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Are you sure everything is okay?" "Yes, of course," I quickly replied, trying to sound natural. "Just a lot of work." She nodded but lingered a little longer than usual. I didn't know if she had noticed something, but her presence made me feel like I was standing on the edge of an abyss. That evening at dinner, I felt the tension in the air becoming almost palpable. Clara talked about her trip, but her words sounded like background noise. Ben avoided my gaze, but his silence was louder than any words. I felt like an outsider in this house, but I knew I was to blame for letting things go so far. When dinner was over, I quickly retreated to my room, but soon I heard a knock at the door. It was Ben. His face looked tired, but his eyes were full of determination. "Emily, we need to be careful," he said softly when I opened the door. "I can't let this ruin everything." His words sounded like a warning, but I felt there was something else. A request, a desperate attempt to save what could still be saved. I nodded but couldn't say anything. All I could do was close the door behind him and let the tears I had been holding back all day finally flow. The next morning I woke up with a heavy feeling, as if an impending storm had already engulfed my life. Memories of the conversation with Ben and how everything between us had changed filled my thoughts. The house, which had once felt safe, now seemed foreign, filled with tension and secrets that threatened to tear everything apart. I heard voices from the kitchen. It was Ben and Clara. They were talking about something mundane, their conversation calm, but I could sense the underlying tension in his tone. I forced myself to get up, summoning all my willpower to keep my emotions in check. When I went downstairs, Clara was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, and Ben was standing by the stove preparing breakfast. They both turned when I entered. "Good morning," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Good morning, Emily," Clara replied, her tone as even as always, but her gaze lingered on me longer than usual. I felt myself tense up but didn't show it. Ben said something too, but I didn't hear his words. My attention was focused on trying to look as natural as possible, even though everything inside me was burning. I took a plate of toast and quickly went out to the terrace to avoid their gazes. Sitting outside, I tried to sort out my thoughts. Everything that had happened seemed both real and unbelievable. I knew Ben was right. This couldn't continue. We had gone too far, and the consequences were already beginning to show. But even knowing this, I couldn't shake the feeling that our relationship had changed forever. The day passed in silence. Clara left for her errands, and Ben was busy in his study. We barely exchanged a few words, but each one was filled with unspoken emotions. I tried to avoid him, but at the same time I felt drawn to him, as if by some invisible force. Later in the evening, when Clara still hadn't returned, I heard a knock at my door. It was Ben. I froze, not knowing what to do, but then quietly said, "Come in." He entered, closing the door behind him. His face was serious, but his eyes expressed a mix of confusion and pain. He sat down across from me, silently looking at the floor for a moment. "Emily," he began, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I don't know how we got to this point, but I can't ignore it anymore." I felt my heart tighten. I expected him to say that we needed to stop, that it had been a mistake. But instead he continued, "I don't want you to feel guilty. This is my fault. I should have stopped it earlier." "No," I replied, feeling my voice tremble. "It's not just your fault. We both knew it was wrong, but we let it happen anyway." He looked up and met my gaze. There was pain, confusion, but also something else, a feeling I couldn't name. I knew he was struggling with himself just as I was. "We need to be honest, Emily. This can't continue. It will destroy us both. But I don't know how to just forget it." His voice trembled and I felt tears well up in my eyes. I couldn't hold back anymore. "I don't want to forget. I know it's wrong, but I can't pretend nothing happened." He looked at me for a long time as if trying to decide what to do. Then he stood up, came over to me, and gently took my hands. "You mean a lot to me, Emily, but I have to think about Clara. She doesn't deserve this." His words hurt more than I expected. I knew he was right, but that didn't make them any easier. He let go of my hands and left, leaving me alone in the room, torn by contradictions. When Clara returned, I felt the tension in the house become almost unbearable. She looked at me as if she knew something had happened, but she didn't say a word. We all had dinner in silence, each lost in our thoughts. Ben avoided my gaze and I tried to look as natural as possible. Later that night, I heard another knock at the door. This time it was Clara. She entered, closing the door behind her, and her face was calm, but her eyes revealed an inner struggle. She looked at me for a long time before speaking. "Emily," she said, sitting down across from me. Her voice was soft but carried a cold certainty. "I know something is going on between you and Ben." My heart stopped. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't. Her gaze pierced me, and I realized she knew more than I thought. "You're a young, smart girl. But you need to understand, some things can't be allowed. I don't want to know the details, but you need to make a decision." Her words hit me like a blow. I knew she was right. I knew I had to leave to stop everything. But it was hard. Too hard. Clara stood up and left, leaving me with her words echoing in my head. That night I didn't sleep. I kept replaying everything that had happened and realized what I had to do. I had to leave. The next day I packed my things and left. Ben was there when I said goodbye, his gaze full of pain. He didn't say anything, but I didn't need words. His silence said more than he could express. Clara stood to the side, watching me with an expression of cold determination. She also said nothing. When I walked out of the house and closed the door behind me, I felt my chest tighten with the weight of my decision. I knew I had done the right thing, but it didn't make the pain any easier. I left knowing this was the end of what could have been but would never be. The end of what I felt but couldn't exist in this world. Time passed, but the memories of what had happened stayed with me. I thought about Ben, about Clara, about how everything could have been different if things had turned out differently. But I knew one thing. Despite all the pain, this was the only possible way out. Sometimes the right decisions are the ones that cause the most pain.